Happy New Year, guys. We are into 2020. I'm Zack and today we're gonna be counting down the 10 worst horror movies of the year 2019. Let me know in the comment section down below what your rankings would be. These rankings are my personal preferences, so if you see something that you don't agree with, that's totally fine. So coming in at 10th place is gonna be Zombieland Double Tap. Now, this isn't a bad movie. This is right in the middle of all the movies that I did see. And with the sequel, I think they did a pretty good job giving us a consistency between the two films. But my biggest problem here was that they didn't really expand on the story. They didn't do anything new. They didn't really play with the idea of the Jesse Eisenberg character having this backlog of all these rules. Instead, they just kind of like focused on the same ones that they had already showed us in the first movie. The characters are a lot of fun to watch, but I just couldn't get invested in any of them because there's so many meandering character arcs and the stakes never really felt very high. So you never really get the sense that anyone was ever in mortal danger or that there was any precedence for the storyline to happen. The final act was also incredibly rushed. So I just kind of left this movie feeling like, yeah, I got a few laughs out of it. It wasn't scary at all. There wasn't a lot of emotional depth to the story or the characters. So this is probably not going to be one that I'm going to be revisiting anytime soon. Before we move on to my next pick, be sure to give this video a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you can stay up to date on all my top 10s and rankings. At number 9, I have Ma. Now, this was a movie that I was kind of hyped for. The trailer looked very interesting. You have Octavia Spencer front and center, who's just a phenomenal actress. And in terms of her performance in the movie, she definitely delivers, but I feel like that's the only thing that this movie had going for it. There's not really any surprises or twists here. You can pretty much see everything coming a mile away. I also felt like they held back just a little too much. There was a lot of risks that they didn't take. She's presented as a very complex and tragic character, and throughout the course of the movie does some pretty nasty things, but it all feels very sanitized and unfocused to me because on one hand, they're showing this movie through Ma's perspective, but the other half of the movie, we're seeing it through Maggie's perspective and her friends. And I feel like we spend way too much time on her friends and none of these characters are particularly likable. So when bad shit starts to happen to them later on, I could care less. In fact, like I'm rooting for Ma rather than these kids. I do feel this movie succeeds in making you feel uncomfortable through Octavia Spencer's character, but I find that those moments were very few and far between. Besides her, all the characters in this movie are very thinly written, so the whole thing just comes off very shallow to me. Again, this is not a movie that I hate. I just think that in terms of this list, this is the one that disappointed me the most. At number 8, I have Eli, and this is the only Netflix horror movie that I saw last year. I didn't hate this movie. Like this, again, this is a very middle of the road movie for me. It's presented as a very standard haunted house movie. The scares work effectively. The movie also does a pretty good job keeping us in the dark for the most of it and then revealing a plot twist towards the end. There are quite a few downfalls. As you can imagine, all the scary stuff only happens at night, and all of these nighttime scenes are pretty much indistinguishable from the last. So you could have taken any scene between point A and point B, rearranged them, and you would have literally had the same result in the end. What I would have liked to see is that every time we got one of these violent ghostly attacks, that something new would have been revealed and it would have advanced the plot along. So the bulk of this movie just feels like a lot of padding, and the finished product just comes off as very subpar. I have it at number 8 because it doesn't piss me off quite as much as every other movie on this list from here on out. So with that said, at number 7 is Child's Play. Now I can give this movie credit for being different. It took the original concept of Child's Play, rewrote the mythology, and gave us something unique that set it apart from the original series. They took a risk with this movie, and that is honestly something that more horror movies should be doing. However, a risk is just that, and it might completely fall flat, and I think that is exactly what happened with this movie. The reason that the original Child's Play works so well is because of the idea that there could be a malevolent being living inside of an inanimate child's object. So when you switch around the DNA of the story from a possessed doll to malfunctioning AI, you throw away all the mystique and horror of that character. The intent was to make Chucky scary again. But then it all becomes so counterintuitive when they infuse comedy through this juvenile street gang who becomes friends with Andy, and then casting Aubrey Plaza to play Andy's mom, who's essentially just playing Aubrey Plaza. So with the finished product, Chucky kind of becomes the one element of the movie with the least amount of personality. Now, Mark Hamill does do an amazing job with his voice acting, but it's still not enough to elevate this movie. The whole thing just comes off as being very soulless soulless and without charm. At number 6, I have Annabelle Comes Home. Now, I don't particularly love the Conjuring universe or any of the movies from it. I kind of just tolerate them. At their best, they're very well photographed, and at their worst, they're just bloated with tiresome jump scares that pad the runtime. This film does do a very nice job of capturing the period that it takes place in. Now, granted, I haven't seen Annabelle Creation, but with this movie, it feels like nothing new is added to the mythology of the series. It feels like they just wanted to make another Annabelle movie, so they came up with this contrived scenario to allow for that to happen. There was never any point in this movie where I felt that any of the characters were in any extreme danger, and this might just be me, but I didn't find anything about it to be scary at all. Now, I wasn't keeping track, but it also felt like this movie took a very long time for any of the horror to kind of commence. And this is kind of my problem with the Conjuring universe, is that I feel like it's just kind of the fast food of horror movies. If you're gonna build up tension, I want a filet mignon, not a Big Mac. I think the only time I'd ever rewatch this is if I was doing a rewatch of all the Conjuring movies, but on its own, it's just very unremarkable. At number 5 is Pet Sematary. Now, there were 3 Stephen King adaptations that came out last year, or at least that I saw, and this one is easily the worst. Like in the case of the Child's Play remake and Taking Risks, I felt like this movie thought that it was being edgy by switching certain things up, but it's still pretty much telling the exact same story, but from more of a what-if angle. But what takes me out of this movie is just how drab and lifeless everything looks and feels. The direction is so uninspired here. It's like they just took the source material, shot it script for scene, and hoped that the twist was going to be enough to distract us from the lack of artistry. The entire movie just looks so dull and morose, and it's just boring. Number 4 is Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. Now, this movie looks great. From a production standpoint, it's shot and edited incredibly well. It's from the same director who gave us The Autopsy of Jane Doe, and that movie had some stunning visuals in it as well. The problem with this movie is that the story is just not engaging at all. I didn't care for it or particularly like any of the characters, nor do I remember anything about them. The first 15 minutes had gone by and I hadn't gotten into the movie yet, and every minute that passed after that, I felt like I fell more and more out of it. I couldn't even tell you what this movie's about apart from a cursed book that belonged to a witch or something like that, and it would write stories on its own which would concurrently play out its events. You can tell that they put a lot of effort into making this movie and just going for it, but the end product didn't succeed at all. Although this movie's not the worst on this list, it's probably one of 2 that I would never rewatch ever. At number 3, I have Countdown. Now, I already did a separate review of this movie, so I'm not going to go into too much detail about why I don't like it. Essentially, this movie takes the concept of Final Destination. It removes all of the existential crisis, it removes all the over-the-top Rube Goldberg-style deaths, and it shoehorns in this completely irrelevant Me Too subplot, which is never properly explored or resolved within the context of the horror. I saw this movie back in October when it came out, and I'm quite surprised that I found 2 more movies that are worse than this one, but I feel like Countdown makes a marginal attempt at telling a story and giving us characters that we're supposed to care about. Even though it fails completely and is very little fun, it is still better than these next 2 entries. So as my runner-up, I have Black Christmas. I asked everyone on my Instagram account what horror movie from 2019 they thought was the worst, and the consensus was that it was Black Christmas. This movie just sucks, really. It's boring as fuck. Nothing happens for over an hour. Trailer spoilage notwithstanding, there's so much given away in the earlier parts of this movie that we're always 5 steps ahead of these characters. Speaking of the characters, other than Imogen Poots, I cannot distinctly distinguish any of these girls. This movie also looks incredibly cheap. It completely lacks any sort of Christmassy tone and feels like it was just kind of slapped together on a shoestring budget. The movie was also shot with an intended R rating, but then completely butchered in post-production, so they were able to give it a PG-13. So you have absolutely no gore, and the entire thing just feels very sanitized. But the biggest failure here for me is the overly political feminist agenda. I know that they're trying to be pro-Me Too here, but the whole thing seems like it's more so targeted at longtime fans of the horror genre. It just comes off as being very unnecessarily antagonistic, and the whole thing just oozes of pettiness. Horror movies have supported feminist ideals for decades now. Is this movie trying to tell me that Laurie Strode and any final girl ever hasn't already stood as a template for female empowerment? But when you look at Laurie Strode, or look at Halloween, or any well-written horror movie in general, the subtext is just that. It's subtext. And here, it's just blatant text. The most frustrating thing about this movie is that this could have just easily literally been written as an original concept. But Blumhouse owned the rights to Black Christmas, so they thought that if they had slapped Black Christmas on the title, it would sell more tickets, and in the end, they just ended up trashing this franchise. This was a rare blessing, and Blumhouse just totally shit the bed on it. But as much as I hate Black Christmas, there's still one more movie on this list that I hate just a little bit more. So as my worst horror movie for 2019, I have The Curse of La Llorona. So I feel like the shooting script for this movie is comprised of 25% exposition, 65% descriptive actions, and 10% Velma from Scooby-Doo screaming out the names of her children. This movie is terrible. At least with Countdown and Black Christmas, there is a modicum of fun to be had. There is nothing here. This movie's also set in the 1970s, and apart from a few rotary phones that you can see here and there, there's really nothing that distinguishes this as a period piece. It's so generic looking, and for the most part, you can't even really see the movie because every scene is so dark. The ghost in this movie is laughable, and you see way too much of her for there to be any real tension. This whole movie is essentially her chasing after Velma's kids, almost getting them, but getting temporarily thwarted until 5 minutes later when she comes back and tries again. Rinse and repeat. And of course, it is not a surprise to me at all that this movie is part of the Conjuring universe. We're reminded of that when we see the priest from Annabelle show up to offer some cross-continuity exposition. I've placed this movie last because it's not fun, it's not visually appealing, it's not cleverly written, it's not coherent, and it's not scary. Thank you so much, guys. I hope you enjoyed this list. Make sure to let me know in the comments down below what your rankings are of the 10 worst horror movies of 2019. I've been Zach Cherry, and I'll be right back.